Welcome to Pods Like Us. I'm Martin Quibell, known to my friends as Marv, and this time I'm speaking with Sam about the show Content and Capable. Hey Sam, thanks for speaking with me today.
No, thanks for having me on. I'm really looking forward to chatting.
And for anybody listening when this comes out, we are recording this in mid to the end of June, 19th of June, and it's not spring, it's autumn in Australia.
Yeah, we do our seasons a bit weirdly. We're actually already in winter, so theoretically we're already fully into the depths of the cold. I'm sure by the time this episode releases, I'll be enjoying the warmer weather that this part of the country offers later in the year.
It's weird when you record episodes so far in advance. I've been that. I've been on Stew World Order, and then by the time the episode has come out, I've completely forgotten what I've said.
Yeah, it is weird. I work as a journalist by day and I don't work too far ahead in terms of content for that. But there are points every now and then I go back for awards or applications or things. And I go back look at my previous work, and it is quite jarring to listen to, and the way I've spoken or said talked about things not even 3 weeks ago.
So, going with that, then we're already going on the tangent. So, going with that, were you introduced to this through your own history in journalism and radio?
So yeah, I went exploring for other podcasts. And ended up finding the podcast That's What I'm Talking About, which is hosted by my now really great friend Mary Clay, and that kind of got me into fandom podcasting. I ended up listening to a lot of fandom podcasts, including the restricted section hosted by my good friend and director of the Deus Ex Media Network, my podcast is a part of, Christina. And about a year or two into listening to it, so about 2021, I was just into my first year of university. I've just finished it, and I pitched this idea for a kind of conversation like podcast.
Yeah.
And it got accepted, and we've worked on it ever since. So I launched that in May of 2021, and we've been running it for a couple of years now. It's been really great. It's been really great to have a podcast that champions creative pursuits and champions people's journeys. But yes, yeah, kind of, I was working in community radio at the time, so I felt kind of qualified to do this, but it still was such a steep learning curve. It's so different to journalism and radio. Don't get me wrong, I still use some of those skills, but I still had to learn so much when I started out.
We both were speaking off air. We were both speaking beforehand in chats about we've both had learning curves through the makings of our different shows, and we'll speak about that on your show when I chat with you on yours. But with yours, one of your curves or one alteration was originally the show was about. It was almost about the transition between going from teenage to adulthood and adulting. You had a wonderful, you used a phrase in one of your episodes that you said that it was almost like adulting 101.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was definitely an interesting one. That was the initial pitch, kind of like, and that was what I intended on taking the podcast in that direction. Admittedly, that kind of niche is very saturated in the podcast. If you search Adulting 101 into any podcast finder, you'll be able to find at least 15 podcasts titled with that name, let alone being ones that were adulting adjacent. And what I found was the guests that I really loved talking to and the topics that really performed well on the podcast were ones that focused on the balance between pursuing people's passions while still kind of having one foot back into what does this interact with my regular life. And so it became that kind of podcast. I really didn't officially, I think it was about 6 months in, I officially kind of pivoted. There was some hard conversations I had to have with the Deus Ex Media Network. At that time it was called the Movie Night Crew Network, and we had to have some hard conversations about what kind of content is good for listeners, what is going to be unique while still remaining faithful to what I want to create, but also what is going to be work in the long term. I think it's really hard when you run a podcast solo, and you know this, Marv, but to chase guests and to make sure that all of the content that you are receiving and talking about is on brand. And I think it's really hard sometimes to be doing that for a really extended period of time. There have definitely been points where I've had guests, and if their content might not necessarily be in my wheelhouse, and I've really struggled to make that a good interview. And so, it's much easier to create a podcast when you're passionate about a topic that you're discussing.
Yeah, I've always said that number one when you're doing a podcast is to pick a subject that you yourself are interested in, because then you will put yourself into it more and you'll be happier about doing a show like that.
Yeah, and I think as well at that time, in 2021, I was 20, and I had a very interesting 18 months, because I had finished high school, I had started university, COVID happened, and I was locked down. And then I, of all things, during the time I was pitching this podcast, moved into my grandparents' place. So I went from being a child in a family home to a grandchild living with two grandparents who hasn't had someone under the age of 25 live with them for the past 15 years. So it was this very interesting where I noticed there were some really apparent differences between my experience and the adults in the room's experience, not to discount the fact that I was an adult at the time, and I do think that the initial desire was a reaction to that. Realistically, it's very hard to remain on the pulse of what teens and young adults are talking about when you're actively progressing out of that teen and young adult phase. I think it's really, really easy to kind of think, oh, this is what someone's talking about, and get stuck in your own worldview. Hence why it wasn't sustainable for a really long time, as well as the fact that it's really hard to find people in their early 20s who can articulate exactly what's going on. There's definitely some really articulate 20-year-olds out there, but it's really hard for you to find a different guest every week to articulate their experience as a guest.
But I'm guessing as well, you've also got the issue where you're having conversations with these people, and did you feel that in some ways you were stifling yourself occasionally? And looking back on it, you might have thought to yourself, if I wasn't stuck with this specific niche, I could actually go into these other areas and just let the conversation flow even more. Do you think that it stifled the conversation in any way originally?
Oh, 100%. And I think this was the thing. I was trying to reverse engineer an idea of a podcast I had envisioned in my head, and it wasn't working. And it took a couple of tries to get to what I liked listening to as an editor, but also what I liked having conversations about with. What it really means is that Content Capable is a really diverse podcast. Guest to guest, we're not having the same conversations, the same tone of conversations. We could be talking about really serious topics, choosing to be childless, and trying to talk about what does that mean when you try to communicate it with family members, through to a really silly podcast episode about of creating, something that journey of creating a podcast that is so incredibly, so incredibly lighthearted. And it's one of those things where it really allowed me to really kind of express how I was feeling and what my interests are at a particular time. It's almost a time capsule for myself
Yeah.
of what has piqued my interest and what has continued to pique my interest over time. There are definitely repeat guests. There are a few people my age that I've been able to get a hold of and chat with, and it's been really great because we've gotten to explore chasing our passions as our careers. I think it's a more common thing nowadays to see young people choose their passion as their career rather than something that might be pragmatic or practical. Oftentimes, we're all told, is that going to pay you a lot, or are you going to be able to survive on a wage of a teacher or a musician or whatever? So often now I see my friends going, actually, I'm really passionate about this. I'm going to make it my career because I know that I'm going to love doing this until I have to retire.
It sort of reminds me of those sort of shows that I used to enjoy, or that you used to get on television and you don't get so much now, or on the radio or any sort of media, where as much as you get these chat shows all over the place where they'll chat to a celebrity of the day, or they'll have a group of celebrities, this, that, and the other. In a sense, speaking with those people, you get a similarity of sort of person with a celebrity. Not to put them down, they're still human beings and they still have the stories to tell. But in some ways, the normal, ordinary person on the street, they're different. There's so much difference between people that you capture in this sort of show, that shows that you used to have on television that talk to the ordinary man on the street or woman on the street or whoever they used to have. So it's catching that niche that isn't actually catered for nowadays by media.
Yeah, and it's a really human desire to want to see yourself reflected in media. And I think you often have a really hard time doing it when, especially at that transitional period in in your life between finishing high school, going through a university degree, and into your mid to late 20s, where you are having to make a decision as to what you want your career to look like for the next 10 to 15 years at the very least. And I think so often we look to the generation that raised us. And to be honest, like, I continue to hear stories from family and friends of that generation who sacrificed what they love to do something practical because they needed to pay the bills, they needed to raise a family. I do think it's probably part of the reason why my generation isn't having children as early, not to get into the news of the day, but this is a really important thing. I think finding something you're passionate about and making it work for you as a career and as a lifestyle before deciding to do other typical things like having children or bits and pieces. I think it's a really important focus of, and to be able to see yourself reflected in that and go, how can I pursue my passion? What are the ways that other people around me are pursuing their passions and turning it into a lifestyle, or plugging their passion into their lifestyle in some way, shape, or form, I think is really, really important.
Yeah, as you grew as a show and you evolved, or the show did, or it has by my listening to it, the closer it gets to that sort of niche where I don't know if you know these shows. So we mentioned just in passing about Jesse, who does the video element for this show for me, and he does his own show called Undiscovered Entrepreneur. And then there is Krista Lowry, who used to be an American. She used to be a news anchor, and she does her own show called Bucket List Careers. And your show sort of nicely fits into that niche where essentially all three of you are speaking with people who, so Krista will talk to people, Bucket List Careers, obviously it's people where they've had this change in their lives, where they've suddenly thought, oh, this is what I want to do with my life. And then Jesse, or DJ Scoob, as he calls himself on the show, what he does there is he gets people who are recent business entrepreneurs. They've started their own businesses up, and the recent, and all three of you are capturing people's almost story of epiphanal moments where something has come to them immediately, and it's that moment where this is what I want to be doing with my life. And I think all three shows are perfect as a 1, 2, 3 to get that positivity and that feel of, yes, we can do these things.
Yeah, I think it's also really important to represent these people. It's the let me rephrase myself. I think it's really important to represent these people as they take this step. I think it's very easy to get lost in your own life and sit there and go, I'm just focusing one day at a time, or I'm just doing the work I'm told to do. You're just a cog in a machine. And to be honest, that's not necessarily a bad thing. How you find fulfillment in your life and that epiphanal moment of, oh, this is what is right for me, I think is really important. And it's really important to represent how people get there because we don't talk about it. Often an actor will talk about that process of how they present these characters. They don't talk about how they became an actor other than I went to acting school, whoop-de-doo. And I think singers do the same thing. It's a really interesting topic to explore. I have a music background myself of how does a musician decide what style of music or what genre of music they want to perform and produce. Look, Taylor Swift's a perfect example of this. I know it's quite topical this year, but look at her albums are like a perfect representation of that journey of trying to find what you want to create. And at different points of time, it's going to be different. And plugging in your passions into your everyday life, I think, is so important. I think it's part of what makes living life real and important. I think you can't feel fulfilled in your life if you aren't pursuing your passions.
We're both musicians. I've got a rack full of guitars at the back of me and bass guitars. There's a tambura in the corner, ukuleles and mandolins over there. There's an electronic keyboard to the side of me, and yeah.
You sound more like a musician than I am. I've moved a few times, so the only thing I really have with me is a trombone and a music stand, and the collection of, as most classical musicians, the collection of mutes and music and random bits and pieces that you collect along the way.
That's the way it is. So, how do you choose the guest, and then what research do you do up until chatting with them?
Yeah, so this is a process that's actually really quite evolved over the past 3 or 4 years. Initially, and you'd notice that I sound very familiar with the first at least five or six
Yeah.
guests on the podcast. They're people I already knew, people I already spoken to. It's very safe to speak to people you already know, especially when you're trying to get something technically correct. And I think that's a really important thing. It really did help me define what I want that podcast to sound and look like. And then it was a lot of social media trawling. I think that it's really important to keep an eye on what is piquing people's interest. In fact, I've been able to speak to podcasts on the start of their rise, like quite steep rise up out of when you start a podcast, you start with zero. But at some point, there will come a point where you have a significant rise in listenership. And I've been able to catch a lot of people right at the start of that. A lot of that is just spending an inordinate amount of time scrolling through TikTok and Instagram and Threads, and to an extent at one point Twitter. But and it's just keeping an eye on that. It's a lot of reaching out to people. 90% of the people I reach out to don't get back to me. And so I send a lot of messages out to people going, hey, do you want to come on? I'd love to have a chat with you, talk about your journey. It's everything from history podcasts through to comedy to musicians and movie review podcasts and radio talent and people doing cool things on the internet. You don't have to host a podcast yourself. You just got to be creating something. To me, it's really important for me to be engaging with people who are on the up and up. It's at that point where they're really starting to set in exactly what their passion is and how it ties into their life. I think a highlight of this recently was last year I got to chat with Grant and Maya from I Laughed, who are this amazing duo that talk about historical events and stories in a very comedic way. They both sit down. One's a history school teacher, the other one's an engineer, and they both sit down and really have these great conversations. And I managed to speak to them right before as they kind of blew up on TikTok. And it was really interesting because they just settled their format like really, really solidly, and it was just really developing that really amazing. And got to talk to them about how that interacts with their day-to-day lives, and they talk about being recognized and endlessly plugging their podcasts to their friends and family, and then they talk about their friends and family on the podcast as well. So it becomes this whole everyone getting involved, and it's become entertainment not just for us to consume but for them to create as well. And it's really interesting. Those are the kind of conversations I really love. It really captures a moment in time, someone's mindset, and gives an insight into what's going through someone's head as they've realized that the thing that they're really passionate about really could be part of their lives, a really meaningful way as well. Yeah, as I said, a lot of reaching out. You'll see as well, Content Capable has a lot of recurring guests who may speak on a variety of topics. I'm really blessed to be a part of the Deus Ex Media network. We have a really great community of people, both who talk in the fandom space, but also are experts in things outside of what they talk about in podcast land. Everything from sociolinguistics to religion to music and photography. And it's really great to talk to these people who are very comfortable behind a mic to chat about how their everyday life interacts with what they're really passionate about. I've also had some really great guests I've spoken to who it's lovely to check in from time to time. And I think that's the part that I am not just creating a community for other people to get involved with me, but it's a community of also for me to be a part of as well. All of these amazing creators and podcasts that I get to follow and watch their journey as they go along. People both my age and older and younger. It's just really amazing to watch.
Yep. You've reminded me of the episode 100 that you did, which was interesting, where you actually spoke with 3 of your fellow podcasters from the network on there, and it was like a turning of the tables because they turned the tables and asked you questions.
Yeah, I think that episode's like a really fun one. It was a lot of fun to record, especially because each of those podcasts are about an hour long. To sit down for an hour and talk to someone is often quite emotionally draining if you haven't done it before or if you're out of practice. And that was a really fun breakup where I just did 3 like 20-minute segments where I got to chat with friends of mine about what they were curious about my journey. And it was a lot of fun. I think it really goes to show how much people are enjoying the journey and watching your journey as it goes along. I've been really blessed. I've been able to travel over to the States where the majority of the creators are based and visit everyone and spend time with the network in person, which really just solidified how important that community is to me. I'm very much a social person. I love talking to people, hence probably why I'm a journalist and a podcast host. And it's just amazing to be a part of those groups and enjoy being creative with a whole bunch of people and do things that might not fit a normal day-to-day life.
You've given away the thing there, the secret there, because in the episode you were making out that you were at a party for the show.
Yeah. Look, we've had parties like that before where I've kind of floated around like that. Not with that set of friends, but definitely with other friends of mine. It's a lot of fun. I usually am a bit tipsy while that happens, and I don't stop talking. So if you think I talk a lot now, just wait until you get a little bit of alcohol, not even a lot, and I'll just won't stop.
That's a podcaster for you. Podcasters will not shut up once you get them started, I don't think.
No, and when you've got 15 podcasters in a room, it is just an endless cycle of noise. It's really tiring. After about a week, I was like, I've had enough. I need some quiet time now.
So recording and editing then, you do that with Zoom?
Yes. So at this point in time, I was really lucky. Uni obviously when we all went through COVID, everyone got Zoom for free for a little while, and the uni gave out a very, very high level of Zoom to all of us to use. So I used that for the time I was studying, and then I stole my brother's for the time he was studying. But yes, I use Zoom. At this point in time, I'm recording and editing through Reaper, which is normally a paid thing. There is a bit of a workaround to not have to pay for it, because if I'm the king, I'm a cheapskate. If I can not pay for a software, I'm not going to. But Reaper's really great. It's a really great software. They let you do this free trial indefinitely, basically. I love it because it's just a little bit more. Audacity is great to start with, and it's exactly what I started with. Once projects start approaching an hour long and start needing complicated edits, Audacity really struggles with it. And Reaper, the way it's coded, just edits things while using a little less file space, which was helpful especially when I've got 3 to 4 guests at a time, in those rare occasions where I do, often what I like to call chaos episodes, and then we'll end up recording for 2 hours. So then you've got 3 or 4 audio files that are 2 hours long that you're trying to splice together, and I've put effects on and I've mastered all of these audios, so it just makes it that slight bit easier. It is quite a steep learning curve, but I was really lucky. Working as a journalist, I ended up using it professionally, and I've used so many different editing softwares. I actually, before I started the podcast, had a background in the Adobe suite, so I was really well versed with editing, especially with Premiere Pro, which I know some podcasters actually use to edit their audio because it's actually really, really handy for editing audio. But then I now use software that's designed for radio, and there's all sorts of other bits of software that I use, not that I use for the podcast, but it has allowed me to be really kind of across most editing software. And yes, recording through Zoom, and then I've got a little $115 mic that I've got sitting beside me that's been my good old faithful for the whole time I've had this podcast.
Right. Reaper, you mentioned that. That's sort of in that area between I'd say that, Audacity is a free entry level and a great software for what it is. And Reaper is almost on the journey in some way. You could think of it as on the way from Audacity up to what would eventually, if you were doing serious sound engineering, up to something like Pro Tools. And it's sort of like in that level between.
It is, and it's really handy. I'm really lucky because Reaper was the preferred editing workspace of the community radio station I worked for 3 years. Sorry, I almost said 4 years. There's a plugin I use that does a really great job at voice compression. So it really heightens someone's voice. So you'll notice, the voice quality is often really great. It also just removes background noise really, really easily. The effects are a little bit more customizable. There was a little bit of, and this is the great thing about Audacity, because a lot of the effects in Audacity are quite rigid, it's really great for a beginner to slap something on and it kind of works most of the time. Yep. But as I started having some complicated background noise or recorded in different locations, I've moved 3 times since having this podcast. I've gone from a tiled floor to a carpet floor to a wooden floor to back to carpet, and then to where I am now. And I think that it's quite the journey. And so being able to adapt what I'm doing for it has been really handy. I still use Audacity. There's a couple of like template files that I still have in Audacity that I just open up Audacity and change them over there.
It's a workaround sometimes where you'll have a certain in place or set thing where it's basically you just take one element and replace, and then you've got your episodes there. Essentially, you got the top, tail, and in some cases, if you do it editing, some people do that.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot of what my editing style is as well, is that my emphasis is for natural conversation. So you'll hear the ums and the ahs and some of the shorter pauses. I delete most of the really long pauses just because no one needs a 2-hour podcast where half of it is pauses. But, still my aim is to deliver a natural conversation. I'm not going to, people speak different ways, and I think it's important to represent that.
I had that realization eventually because I started and I heavily edited to a ridiculous degree in some case. And then it's interesting because you can listen back in that situation, and you listen back to something and you think that conversation doesn't quite sound natural in some ways. And it's an interesting learning curve to do that, to realize that, and suddenly decide, if this is supposed to be a conversation, it needs to be looser.
There's a limit to it, I find. I work in radio, so obviously I work with really highly edited interviews. That's me editing journalists' questions, I edit talent's answers, especially when you're talking about complex topics. People trip over themselves and repeat themselves all the time. And there's no point, like, it's not good radio to create that kind of thing. So in day to day, at my day job, I do a lot of really delete every long pause, and if I'm going to repeat, if I hear someone repeating themselves, or I'll cut the first 5 minutes of audio because I don't need that, I'll write that in the introduction. All of that process doesn't happen because I think once you head over the 12-15 minute mark, once you hit that, it becomes hard to listen to. You need some of those natural pauses and natural repetitions for comprehension's sake, but also for human's sake. The uncanny valley is really quite jarring, and it loses your focus really quickly. And the way that some people speak, the way most people speak, is naturally engaging.
So the logo then for the show, why did you pick that, and how did you get that logo?
The logo was an interesting journey, to be honest. There's a few iterations that I had. I created an initial draft in, I want to say Photoshop. It might have been Canva. I don't think I used Canva at that point, so I actually forget exactly what program I ended up using. Maybe even Microsoft Paint, God forbid. I took a couple of these versions, and I had a friend of mine who was studying design at university, and so what I did was I sent those three drafts that I'd made because I wasn't particularly happy with them, and my friend Theo, he's still one of my great friends, took that design and refined it and created a really engaging logo. Obviously, the name was really important. I really do love you. It's interesting. I was talking about logo design with someone who's preparing to launch a podcast today. And I said, the really important thing is you need something visual in your podcast that's like an icon of what your podcast is. Yeah. Some sort of image. The adulting please wait loading thing I thought was really, really interesting, visually engaging. It's a different color. I really love that shade of blue. I don't know where it came from, but it definitely was one of those things that I just saw it and was like, that's exactly what I want. And then and a hot tip for those who are creating new stuff, ask your artist to send a vector version of the image so you can scale it up and down. If you're going to print it on a massive billboard, you need a vector version of whatever artwork you're using. And because I didn't, like, I want to always keep my options open, and I'm pretty aware of this. I asked for it, and yeah, it was really simple. Basically, my friend Theo told me that he just wrote out the name of the podcast and then kind of just did that loading sign, and that was it. It was pretty much no iterations from there. The only change that's happened significantly to the logo since the podcast launch was because when we rebranded to Deus Ex Media, we wanted to put a little Deus Ex Media logo. So you'll see that in the bottom corner. That was a bit of finagling there, but my friend and Deus Ex Media director, Christina, helped me with that one there, because I made the rookie error of filling the whole square of a podcast logo. You need to make sure it fits in a circle on Instagram.
That's true. There is more to that logo though. Like you said, you've got it's almost like a loading bar that you get on one of these programs that you have on a computer, where you're waiting for it to almost like, or installing almost, where it's going across.
And I think I think it's really representative of the fact that your journey's never quite finished. If you think of when something's installing, it takes about forever for something to install on a computer nowadays. And even back then, I was feeling very retro, like 90s core when doing this. And I think it is one of those things. It might feel like forever, but the journey's important, and getting everything right is really important before leaping off.
Yeah, it reminds me of the old days of having the old disc for games and for software, and that going across there like that. But you've also got that really playful font that he's using as well for the lettering.
Yeah, that was hand drawn. I do love the way it all kind of puts itself together. I think it's a really important, just kind of really showing that this podcast doesn't take itself super seriously. Let's be honest, I've got a day job, I've got a very busy life outside of podcasting, so I'm not going to take this podcast as seriously as others might, and I think it's still really important to represent that I don't expect everyone to take everything 100% absolutely seriously day to day.
So show structure then, is there a show structure, or is it basically open the show, then get on with the conversation and then close the show?
Yeah, kind of. I think it's important to note, and I've said this a couple of times, I'm a journalist by trade, and naturally in that way I am just like allergic to giving people questions ahead of time. It's just something that in the industry we don't do, because we want people's genuine and honest reactions. We don't want someone reading off a script or reading notes. And if there is a time for notes, and I should say that this is a personal preference. There are plenty of scripted shows in podcast land that I think do absolutely amazing work. But realistically, I just wanted, when I had to review, every time I've sat down and reviewed the podcast, I really enjoyed the more natural conversations. Doesn't mean I won't go in and prepare. I think, going back to the research thing, often I will make sure I try to listen or consume the content that people are producing. Often I much prefer to consume smaller bites. I don't want to be an expert in someone's content before going in. I think it's important to have some of that genuine curiosity and not knowing, so you can get a genuine reaction out of me. But at the same time, realistically, we intro the podcast, and I will have maybe 2 or 3 questions prepared, and then I'll let the conversation go from there.
Yeah.
I've spent 3 years at uni learning how to ask follow-up questions and expand a topic. There are definitely points where that doesn't work. There are definitely things that I've got to sit down and go, I need to plan this out a little bit more. There are definitely episodes where I want to hit key points, and I try to write them on a post-it note and stick it on my screen and go, I need to make sure I hit this stuff. And you'll find there's a couple of episodes that really plug friends' new ventures, creative ventures, whether that is Wildlink Press, which a lot of my writing friends have been a part of, but whether it's new podcasts or celebrating a year of podcasting with some of the network podcasts. It's really important to make sure you hit some of those common key themes and elements and questions to keep that line of questioning really consistent through that journey. But it's fairly loose. I'll really make sure that I do ask like a what's next question towards the end. And I also find it's really important to make sure that I plug that we have an opportunity to plug media, consuming media. I think it's a really great insight into what people think and the way that people operate. It's not always easy to convey in a conversation the vibe someone gives off, but a piece of media is really great at giving that vibe, or maybe helping someone expand on a topic, talking about finances or talking about queer literature. There are definitely books out there that really would help expand someone's view a lot further than a 90-minute conversation might.
They're my favorite bits of the show, actually, when they go into those areas where you never you didn't, leading up to the episode, expect to go into.
Yeah, I think the first one that really stood out to me in that aspect was the episode I did with Carrie, who used to host the podcast Fandom's Gone Wrong, and she talked about her work collecting Barbie dolls. And it was so fascinating to sit and ask her all of these questions that you wouldn't even think about asking. And it really spurred on what this format looks like.
Are there any other standout moments for you?
Standout moments. There's a few. I think it's this year is not necessarily 100% the year to go by. I've had some personal things happen that have meant my schedule has been super inconsistent. I had, though, Adil Rafai from the, oh gosh, now I've completely forgot what podcast Adil does. Hey Riddle Riddle. I've had Adil Rafai on from Hey Riddle Riddle. I think that that was a real highlight. He's such an amazing, lovely human being, and I think it was really important to sit and ask him some of these questions. He does it professionally for a living. That's a really question. I think as well, some of my favorite podcasts, my most listened to one at the moment is one I recorded in early last year where I spoke to this creator who's named Matter of Fact on Instagram and on TikTok about her work as a social media content creator covering the royal family. It's just such an interesting one where you're talking about a controversial topic in the broader sense of the world, and you basically become a journalist. The other one that I really love is the conversation I had, as I said before, with Grant and Maya from I Laughed. That one had mad technical difficulties. We were on a call for almost 3 hours in the end, but it was so funny and just filled me full of energy. And yeah, I really, really love doing it.
Yeah, those sort of conversations where you have technical difficulties, they they can be interesting but also problematic when it comes to the editing stage.
Yeah, it is. It becomes a long process, and I kind of dread the editing stage when I know that there's a lot of editing that needs to be done to a show. I'm often posting quite late on a Monday afternoon, Australia time, because I'll record on the weekend and not really want to edit it on the same weekend that I've recorded it, or I'll record 4 or 5 episodes in advance and then I'll go, I should just edit 3 episodes in one weekend. But even editing takes a lot of energy out of you and you feel like you're reliving that conversation again.
Yep. When I recorded, I did a group chat, and we did a group chat which was about the 60th anniversary of the first Bond film, Doctor No. So I did this thing which I will never do this again, where I put the link, and I recorded that using Zencastr, because that was back when Zencastr used to give you some free time, and now it doesn't. And I used Zencastr for that, and I put the Zencastr link in a general message on a page. If you want to come and have a talk about the 60th anniversary of James Bond, here's the link. And
Yeah.
I think we ended up with 10 of us in total in the chat.
Wow.
About it. And then, so the issue that you've got there is Zencastr gives you individual files, but for some reason, one or two of the people were having problems with their connections and kept cutting out, coming back in. And I think I got it in 2 or 3 bits. So then I'm trying to put all these people together and then work out where all these bits fit in with each other and then do the edit around that.
Yeah, that's absolutely crazy. I can't imagine doing that. It's just I've had ones where I've forgotten to do an audio sync, or I've forgotten to line up things, or my internet's gotten out of whack, and it's just and really, really quite annoying because it's just so much extra effort of sitting down, and like theoretically you could do it if you're paid to do it, but the problem is that I'm not being paid for this work. I've got to find time in my day, and especially the last 4 years, I've been incredibly busy between I ran 2 university clubs, I was studying full time, I also was working full time, and then as a volunteer on top of that, there was a lot going on. So I just dreaded having to sit down for 3 hours at a time and just put a podcast and then the social media together to promote it.
Yeah, the social media is a big thing with all of this and getting it out there to people. You can go into the world of podcasting without realizing all of that you might just think, oh, you just come on, you go on to Zoom or whichever, and it records it for you, put them together, put it out there, job's done. And it's so much more than that.
So many people do that, just do absolutely nothing, and then wonder why they don't get engagement. And I think it's really just a hot tip. If you just put a little bit of money and a little bit of time into it, it often produces such better results just so immediately. That growth trajectory at the very start is so high and so fast, and it'll peter out. There's a point where it doesn't really matter what better microphone or what better software you buy, or how, whether if you have an editor or something. The podcast will still be the same depending on the conversation that's had, but that initial investment I think is really important. Hence why I dropped some money on a good microphone and made sure I was getting good quality audio, because then I could just focus on making sure I was creating good conversation.
Yeah. Actually, we'll skip forward to that one then, that point in this list. So have you got any other tips for podcasts?
Yeah, look, I think as well, don't let yourself be bogged down in the numbers. I think for a really long time myself, I let myself look at the numbers and go, nah, I just can't. I'm just never going to be able to compete with X, Y, or Z. Or I look at other podcasts in the network that operated on fan bases rather than on audience, and it's really hard to compare those. Everyone starts a podcast at a different time.
Yeah.
And it's very easy to look at the numbers that you've got on the back end and go, oh, I'm actually not doing that. Realistically, I started this podcast in 2021 and we're recording in June. A couple of weeks ago, I hit 5K listeners, which is really amazing. I really am really happy about that. But, to me, the importance is growth rather than numbers. I want to see that I'm improving week on week. The other thing is just invest into a really good social media strategy. I can't necessarily preach about the values of a good social media strategy just because I'm terrible. I kind of do the bare minimum because I'm just really bad at following through. But if you consistently post clips and promote the episode and memes and other associated content, as well as sharing content on genuine, like through reposts and shares on stories and bits and pieces, you will develop that community of people who really trust opening up your story or opening up your feed to really figure out what's been going on, what's interesting, what's new. It also really helps curate a really great algorithm. So then therefore you get really great suggestions of potential collaborators as well. Big piece of advice is just not do this by yourself as well. Either have someone to support you or someone to do the podcast with you. It's just so hard to just spend so much time alone and then continue to be encouraged to create more and more content.
Yeah. I think that people who do these solo podcasts where it's just them basically talking about a subject for a period of time, I think that's an incredibly brave, very difficult situation to be in.
And there are some people who do it really, really well. And there's been creators I've spoken to who have done it really, really well. And the other thing I think as well, podcast listeners are really good at sniffing out BS. We aren't stupid. And so a lot of times I see a lot of brand managers and social media managers going, you must have a podcast as a part of your social media strategy. Podcasting isn't an arm of social media. Podcast is a completely different medium in and of itself. And it's really important that if you're creating a podcast, you're creating a podcast for a genuine reason other than to promote your brand or promote who you are. Their podcast listeners are really smart and they are going to smell a rat and go, you're not here to create community, you're here to convert me into a customer.
Yep. But in the cases where they do that sort of thing and they're doing it for the whole promotion of something, where that does work, I think, is when you get these situations where I've seen it with some musicians or something where they've done that. They've used this as a promotional tool in a sense. And you can tell those that don't work and those that do work, because the ones that I think do work is when they do a deep dive and you get their actual story itself there, rather than it just basically being a promotion. When they actually open up on these sort of things, That's
I think there's definitely room, if you're an expert in your field, to sit down and explore the intricacies of your field. It's got to be engaging though. I think first and foremost, you can definitely promote your work. I do it at the end of every Content and Capable episode. I plug my own social media because that's where you're going to find my work as a journalist. And let's be honest, this work as a podcaster has helped my work as a journalist, and my work as a journalist has helped me as a podcaster. But I'm also really aware of, if you're selling first and creating content second, that is just not, and it's typical. Like, you can tell an ad on social media within about, I think it's almost 0.2 seconds now. Most people can tell of a video whether something is an ad or it's the creator there follows genuine content. It's really easy to tell. The tone shift, the location shift, the quality shift. Brands are looking for stuff that isn't genuine anymore, and I think the brands that are doing the brands and the organizations that are doing the right thing are looking for genuine engagement first before they sell their content.
going on the original concept for the show. What advice would you give to people who are in that transitional period from into adulthood?
I think it's really important to have conversations with a wide variety of people. I think one of the things that I really benefited from was I intentionally kept a lot of options open when deciding where in life I wanted to go. And that really allowed for me to sit down and, when I had to make a decision, really explore those options in quite deep conversations. Yeah. I almost became a scientist. And so I got to have some really upfront conversations with friends of mine who were planning on going into science or who were already scientists, to chat about, what does science look like? Is this something for me? And get a taste of it, go and physically experience it. Same with music. I had amazing opportunities to get a really close taste of it. I ended up on communication and then ended up in journalism through that. And I think that was just a byproduct of what I realized through both of my tastes of science and music, is that I really loved talking to people and explaining things to people. I actually wasn't particularly good at science, and I wasn't the best musician in my cohort. So what I actually did excel at was taking these complex concepts and breaking them down in a way. And that's really important. Having those conversations, and then sit down and imagine what your life would be like in that field or doing what you're doing. I think it's really important every now and then to sit down, close your eyes, and imagine what your life in 5 years might look like. Where are you working? What are you doing? What are you hoping and doing? Seeing that vision and then figuring out what the journey what you would think the journey would look like to get there. I still do it myself. I want to be a journalist. I'll continue being a journalist. But right now I'm a breakfast radio producer. If I want to be a foreign correspondent, if that's where I envision myself in 5 years' time, what steps do I need to make over the next 5 years to put myself in a position to be a foreign correspondent in 5 years? And that's really important. You can't pursue your passion without support, I think, as well. You've got to find people who are like-minded, who are willing to support you in your endeavors, whatever they may be, and really work out what does my life look like pursuing my passion. It's not an easy thing to pursue your passion. It's really hard. You have to make sacrifices, and there will be regrets along the way, but you've got to keep pursuing it and make sure you're working towards that goal.
So going back to the question of podcast then, what shows do you like to listen to? And in that, which sort of shows that you listen to, do you think that people would enjoy listening to or get something out of?
Yeah, look, I have a wide variety of podcasts I listen to. It's all over the place. A lot of Deus Ex Media Network podcasts. So the Restricted section is a really great one. Mary Clay's Skywalk Before You Run podcast is really great. She's experiencing the Star Wars universe for the very first time. But also that newsy side of me, I listen to Shameless, which is a pop culture podcast for smart people who love dumb things, as they're saying. It's a really great one. I have struggled to keep on top of celebrity news. Just don't know how I've missed that all. So putting it in podcast form and explaining it in a really smart way, I think is really important. And then comedy is really important to me as well. Well, I laughed. I've plugged them 3 times now on this podcast. It's like Beetlejuice. They'll appear now in the Zoom call with us. They're really great. They're really funny. They're really long form. I love a long form podcast. I want an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours of audio to listen to. BBC Radio 4 does a really great Friday night comedy podcast that has been a favorite for years and years and years. And then a couple of other ones on the side, things like, sorry, it's not here in this list of mine. Weird. That's very weird. But things like Corporate Gossip, where it talks about, you know, dodgy CEOs and the silly things they get up to. I'm a person who doesn't consume a huge amount of TV, but, you know, I will, you know, listen to a whole bunch of podcasts all day, every day.
For speaking with me today, where can people find you and get hold of you, Sam?
So you can find Content Capable, the podcast, on Instagram. We're on at Content, the letter N, Capable. I don't know why I chose the letter N to represent the word and, but it's there. You'll find us on Threads and on Facebook as well. We don't do Twitter. That's just a thing. That's a network-wide thing. We just don't think that Elon Musk creates a safe space on Twitter for our listenership, so we aren't on there. But yeah, mostly on Instagram and on Threads. I try to post or repost things on there fairly regularly. You can find me at sam.the.journalist on Instagram and on TikTok. I don't post a huge amount on there. I'm sure at some point I will, but at this point in time, I produce breakfast radio. I'm not like a journalist on the scene or breaking news headlines at this point in time. So I just kind of show my journey through creating radio and creating journalism. You get to see all of my adventures as a community radio journalist. You'll see some lovely photos of me in the high country of Australia this time last year I was skiing. So nice. It's amazing to see the journey that I've been able to take, looking back over it and scrolling through those photos. It's a bit self-serving, but it's a lot of fun.
That's cool. Thanks for speaking with me today, Sam.
No, thank you very much for having me on, Marv.
Thank you. You can find Pods Like Us on any streaming platform. We are also on Patreon, and you can contact us through podslikeus@gmail.com. Anyway, thank you everyone for listening, and I hope you can listen again to another episode of Pods Like Us.